First, let me apologize that the bulletin was inaccurate about tonight's lesson. You'll hear that lesson, but it will be in a few weeks. And so tonight, instead, we have a different lesson that I guess you don't know the topic of. So let me inform you of that. Tonight's lesson takes the form of a question, and it's a question that I imagine any Christian has had when reading the Old Testament and then reading the New Testament, especially passages like Hebrews that was read for us, chapter 9, and then seeing how the Jews operate today. And the almost natural question is, well, what do the Jews do today now that they do not have a temple, a priesthood, and they don't offer sacrifices? And so tonight we're going to try to answer that. And let me start out by saying this, that trying to answer this question about a group of people from a certain religion is kind of like asking what Christians think about the Holy Spirit. You're not going to get one answer. And so when we talk in general terms, understand that that's what it is. When we're talking about the Jews, we'll mention some differences as far as their beliefs are concerned, but we are having to generalize here because there are different groups within Judaism. Some are more conservative, some are more liberal, just as you would find within Christianity. And so they'll have different answers to some of these questions. But we do want to explore this idea tonight and maybe inform ourselves better than we have been before about what exactly caused these things to happen, why they don't do this at all today, and where this came from or where this is headed now and even into the future. So we'll go by category here. First, the temple, and then the priesthood, and then the offerings. And we go in that order for a reason that will become clear as we have this discussion tonight. And so the first part of this, as we mentioned, is that the Jews don't have a temple. And so if you didn't know that already, let's clarify that there is no temple in Judaism today. It does not exist. It hasn't existed for some 2,000 years. And there is no replacement for it. And synagogues, even though those are a major part of Jewish religion, are not temples, and they are not supposed to function as temples. They're much closer to churches today in Christianity, in that they are a place for people to gather together for fellowship and to sing songs of praise and to read from Scripture, but they are not a place where sacrifices are offered. There's no necessity of having a priesthood with synagogues. They're just buildings that people meet in. And so there is no temple, like we said, and that has been true for 2,000 years, but it was also true before 2,000 years ago. That is to say that if you go back farther into Jewish history, even at the end of the Old Testament, there is a period where there is no temple. And so during the Babylonian exile, there was no temple. There were no offerings being made in Jerusalem anymore. And so it wouldn't be the first time whenever we see it as it happens today. But instead, after the destruction of Solomon's temple, which is about 587 BC, until about 516 BC, there is no temple. During that time, all the temple service ceases for a while. And so synagogues would actually come about during that time period. And synagogues, in a way, not to belittle them, but they sort of are a cheap replacement for the temple. A place where people can gather and do good things potentially, but they can't offer the sacrifices. And so the only reason that synagogues exist is to give some formality to the kind of worship that Jews do from that time onward. But the second time that the temple is destroyed, it is completely destroyed. It's destroyed in AD 70, so 70 years after the birth of Christ, 40-something or almost 40 years after the death of Christ. And this happens in response to another Jewish revolt against Rome. And this time Rome pretty much says that they've had it. And according to the historian Josephus, who lives around that time and records these events, he says this about the city of Jerusalem after it was destroyed by Rome. He says, "It was so thoroughly laid even with the ground by those that dug it up to the foundation, that there was nothing left to make those that came there believe that it had ever been inhabited." So just to give an idea of what happened to Jerusalem, if you stumbled across it, you wouldn't know there was a city there in the past. They destroyed everything. They burned everything, including the temple itself. And so from 70 AD onward, there has not been a temple in Jerusalem. And there's not been a temple anywhere else either as a replacement. And so the question may be this that would come to mind: why didn't the Jews rebuild the temple? And the answer is actually pretty simple. Initially, they were still under Roman rule. Were the Romans going to take it back and say, no, you can go ahead and have your temple? That's not going to happen. They would be under Roman rule for a few hundred years, and then the Byzantine Empire, which was kind of Rome anyway. And so there was never really the option during that time. They were persecuted somewhat, even in that situation that they found themselves in. After that, they were conquered by Muslim empires, and they would be under Muslim control for the next 1,300 years, up until World War I takes place. And so if you're asking why didn't the Jews rebuild, when did they have the chance? And so there never really was an opportunity to rebuild the temple in Jerusalem. I should perhaps mention that the only time that they weren't under Muslim control was briefly during the Crusades, but that wasn't really going to help much either. But the other question then is, why not now? Now that there is an official state of Israel, why not go ahead and rebuild the temple? And so there are a couple of reasons for that they haven't rebuilt. The first one is that even though Israel is an independent state, if you know anything about it, it's independent, but it is a socio-political mess. And they sit in the middle of a region that mostly despises them. And so if you were to try to build a temple there, that's going to be a problem by itself. Not to mention, in Jerusalem specifically, the city is pretty well segregated by Jews and Muslims and Christians. And so the Temple Mount is under mostly Muslim control. Not only that, but for about 1,000 years now, there has been the Al-Aqsa Mosque, better known by its central feature, the Dome of the Rock, sitting on the Temple Mount. And it's been there for about 1,000 years. If you tried to destroy that or move that or build a temple next to that, how well are the Muslims both within the territory of Israel and outside of going to like that? And so if you don't want to start another Israeli-Arab war, you really can't do that. And so why hasn't it been rebuilt? That may be the simplest reason. But another part of this is that many Jews look to the pattern shown in the book of Ezekiel. In chapters 40 through about 48, Ezekiel tells and gives the exact dimensions of a new temple that's supposed to be built. And it's pretty dry reading, but it does give this perfect description of what the temple's supposed to be like. Well, Jews, as is their nature, in religious matters that is, they try to decipher it and try to debate the details almost to a fault. And so the secondary problem, not just the social or the political problem that they would face, would be, how do you agree on how this temple is supposed to be built? Because there are differing interpretations of exactly what that temple is supposed to look like. Now, for our part, we would look to Ezekiel and say, well, really, that's more of a model of the church that will come later, not so much a model of a real temple that's supposed to be built, or perhaps it's a model of the temple in heaven, but it's not the same thing. I understand there's not quite the same idea of a temple in heaven, but regardless, there are plenty of disputes about that. Not only that, but who would be authorized to even build such a temple? They would need to be Levites, probably, in order to do so. And so there's a little bit of dispute there, which we'll get into later. But they can't really agree on that, much less the details and the actual planning of a temple. And then the third reason that the Jews haven't rebuilt the temple is that a lot of Jews think that it will be rebuilt when the Messiah comes. And so who are you to build the temple now if the Messiah is going to come back and build it himself? And so you've got these different groups and these different lines of thinking within Judaism, and you've got these external pressures, and so it's not likely that a temple is going to be rebuilt. That doesn't mean there aren't efforts to do that exact thing, but they aren't making much traction, and they probably won't. And so the question is, what do they do now without a temple? And this is kind of anticlimactic, but they don't do anything. And really that's more of a function of the other two things that we're going to talk about. What is the temple for? It's a place to offer sacrifices to God and for the priesthood to do just that, to offer sacrifices. If you don't have a priesthood and you aren't making offerings, do you really need a temple? Not so much. And so we're going to take a look at these other two aspects of this too, as mentioned. So the second thing is the priesthood. In the Old Testament, if you aren't aware, there was a Levitical priesthood, but we need to break that down a little bit more. Priest could come from the tribe of Levi, but if you were a Levite, that doesn't mean you were a priest. And so a Levite, someone born of the family of Levi, one of the sons of Jacob, you could serve in some capacity to help in the temple process, but you could not serve as a priest in preparing or even discarding of offerings that were made. That was reserved for Aaronic priests, that is, priests who were already Levites, who were the children of Aaron. Aaron was a Levite himself, only a few generations removed from Levi, but you had to be of his specific family within the tribe of Levi to serve as a priest. Okay? More specific than that, there was a line of high priest, which had to be in succession of the sons of Aaron specifically, and it would always be the oldest son would take on the mantle of the high priest, and that's how it was supposed to be down through the years. And so the question is, why is there not a priesthood still in existence today? The simple answer may be because there's not a temple and there aren't sacrifices, but there's another reason that's often given. And so bear with me for just a second. You have probably heard before that there was in the temple in AD 70, when the temple was destroyed, that there was a set of genealogical records of the priesthood, and that these records were destroyed. Therefore, people today cannot trace their genealogy back to the tribe of Levi or back to Aaron specifically. Let me suggest to you that that is at best a partial truth. And I'm guilty of repeating it as well. It's kind of like what we talked about this morning. It's an easy answer, it's a comfortable answer to give somebody, but it's based on some assumption and it's based on almost no historical fact. So let's talk about it for just a second. It's possible that there were some records of genealogy kept in the temple, but there's nothing in the text of Scripture that indicates that, and there is little to no historical evidence to corroborate that. There's nothing that we have that would tell us, yes, there was a definitive role of priest and who could serve and who couldn't serve kept in the temple. We don't have that information. I don't know where that idea came from, but it's been repeated many, many times, and we don't want to continue to repeat it because we don't have any evidence that points to that. Now, that being said, the best evidence we have is potentially in Ezra, which we'll talk about in just a minute when we go back to Ezra, but there really is not enough evidence to continue to teach this. Now, the other problem with this is that if we're trying to say that there is a definitive list of genealogies of the priests kept in the temple, well, what does that mean for Jews that live outside of Jerusalem or outside of Israel as a whole? Because in the first century, as we mentioned not too long ago, in the first century, the majority of Jews lived outside of the nation of Israel. Were their records kept in the temple? That's not even possible. And so if they kept their own records independently, wouldn't those records have survived the destruction of Jerusalem? Well, sure. And so it's a strange idea that has been passed around here, but again, it doesn't seem to have any basis in reality. The other thing that we might mention with this is oral tradition, in that the Jews were heavily reliant on oral tradition, much more so than paper record keeping. And so it's likely that the records of who was who and whose family you were a part of were maybe not kept on paper so much as they were told and known by other people. So all of that to say that we seem to be making the wrong point when it comes to what happened in the first century. We don't want to be guilty of something that's not a historical fact in the first place, but again, there is a reason in the first century and in the second century that many records or even just knowledge would have been lost about the genealogies and who could serve as priest, but it's not based around the temple. There may have been something in the temple, there may have been some kind of records, but that's not the problem. The problem is the destruction of Jerusalem and even a later revolt that would happen about 50 years after the destruction of Jerusalem, which we've talked about briefly before, but the Bar Kokhba rebellion, which was essentially the same thing that happened that got the Jews wiped out in AD 70, happens again in 130 or so. And so between these two events, there is a massive slaughter in the first and second century of Jews, specifically Jews living in the land of Israel. And why does that matter? Well, because it doesn't really matter that much if the temple's destroyed if you wipe people out by the millions. And the best numbers that we have, again from Josephus, he suggests that in the revolt of AD 70 and the retribution from Rome, that some 1.1 million Jews are killed, mostly in the area around Jerusalem, which only had a population of maybe 500,000 at the time, and that in the Bar Kokhba rebellion, again, about 6 decades later, that another at least 600,000 people were killed. And so what we're saying is, in the span of one lifetime, about 2 million Jews are killed. That may not sound like a lot today with how massive our populations are, but it's estimated that in the first century there were about 8 million Jews living in the area of Israel. Again, in one lifetime, 1/4 of the Jewish population is slaughtered. It may be that there were records in the temple, but what's the bigger problem? That whole families, not just wife and husband and kids, whole families, the patriarch down through multiple generations, were killed. Their families ceased to exist. You may have all been from the tribe of Levi. What does it matter? The whole family has been killed, or if they haven't, then they fled from the land of Israel. Millions more were refugees at this time, probably not taking a whole lot of their culture with them, and not necessarily taking any record of who they were with them either. And so it is true that in the first century, the Jews lost much of their genealogical identity, but it's not because there was some master list kept in the temple. It's because they were killed in droves. And so we want to be historically accurate when we talk about this. We want to recognize that it's this kind of death that causes the problem, the scattering of Jews after this, the persecution of Jews for centuries after this, both in Christian Europe and in the Muslim Middle East and Africa as well. And so it didn't matter where the Jews went, they were still persecuted. Many of them were still killed after this point. And so it would be very hard for people to keep these records, but not impossible, as we'll talk about in just a second. I mentioned Ezra just a moment ago. We'll go back to Ezra and we'll take a look in chapter 2. Ezra chapter 2, and we'll be down verse 60. We'll start in 59, I think. There are a fair number of names to pronounce here, but it does make a point worth looking at. Ezra chapter 2, verse 59. It says, "And these were the ones who came up from Telmala, Telharsha, Cherub, Adon, and Immer, but they could not identify their father's house or their genealogy, whether they were of Israel." So already in verse 59, what we're learning is there were some people who, whenever the Jews come back from Babylonian captivity, and Ezra is trying to get the wall of Jerusalem rebuilt, there are people who are coming back and saying, well, we're Jews. And some of them can't even prove that. let alone that they are Levites, which is what the next verse deals with. Verse 60 says, the sons of Delilah, the sons of Tobiah, the sons of Nekoda, 652, and the sons of the priest, the sons of Habiah, the sons of Koz, the sons of Barzillai, who took a wife of the three daughters of Barzillai, the Gileadite, and was called by their name. Verse 62, these sought their listings among those who were registered by genealogy, but they were not found. Therefore, they were excluded from the priesthood as defiled. So a couple things. Number one, as mentioned previously, this is maybe the best evidence to say that the Jews may have kept some kind of list of genealogy. Let me already state one problem with that. What had just happened before these events? The temple was destroyed by the Babylonians. If there was some kind of master list in the temple, it was already gone. And so whatever list Ezra is going off of, it's not that. And so that doesn't really give any evidence to say that that was a practice that would happen hundreds of years later in AD 70. But the more important thing in these verses is the principle in Judaism that if you cannot prove that you are of the tribe of Levi, you cannot be part of the priesthood. Well, that does have an effect today, in that there are many, probably thousands, hundreds of thousands, maybe even millions of Levites who can't necessarily prove that they are, in fact, Levites. And so if they are not Levites, then they would not be authorized to serve in the temple service. Actually, we could go a step farther than that. Imagine, as a Jew, trying to offer a sacrifice to God. Even if you did rebuild the temple, you offer a sacrifice to him and you are not a Levite and you're not of the sons of Aaron. Is God going to accept that sacrifice, or will that defile him? And will that defile the person making that offering? And so it's not as if you can just say, well, I think I'm a Jew and I think I might even be a Levite, and so I'm qualified. According to what happened in Ezra, if you can't prove it, there is going to be a problem. Now, that being said, what do the Jews do today about this? Do they have priests? There is no priesthood in Judaism, in any branch of Judaism. There is no group of people who identify as priests. That being said, the other half of that partial truth that we mentioned before is that oftentimes people will say, well, since the genealogical records were destroyed in AD 70, which, as we already pointed out, is not historically accurate, therefore, there are no Jews today who can serve as priests. Well, that's not really true either. Again, many of them probably can't prove it, but today we have more options available to us as well. There are certainly those who can trace back their genealogy far enough to prove that they are Levites. There are even those who can trace back their genealogy well enough to prove that they are of the sons of Aaron. That's really all that you need. And from there, today, you could do genetic testing to prove that these people are closely related enough that they must be Levites, or they must even be of the sons of Aaron. And so it is possible to reform a priesthood if you wanted to in Judaism today. There are even a few last names that are common among those who are Levites, specifically names like Levitt, names like Levine, names like Cohen, which comes from Kohan, which is the Hebrew for priest. And so there are people who, just by their last names, are almost definitely Levites even today, as those names were passed down for many generations. But they don't serve as priests. And really the only distinction between any Jew and a Levite is that a Levite, or someone who's of the family of Aaron, can perform certain tasks in a synagogue that others can't. But it's nothing to do with offerings. It's more about who can read in what order of passages of Scripture when you're together for a time of worship. It really has very little bearing on anything that you might think it would affect. And so again, there is some difficulty in confirming Levitical heritage or Aaronic heritage specifically, and they must be proven somehow to be part of the Levitical priesthood if they were going to recreate some kind of priesthood today. But the problem is, for priests, and this is why we did this in this order, why have a priesthood when essentially they're out of a job? What is the job of the priesthood? There are some other things that they do apart from making sacrifices, especially when it comes to leprosy and dealing with mold in houses and some other specific laws in the Old Testament. But their primary function is to offer sacrifices to God. If there's no offering, then what benefit is it to you to have a priesthood? Okay, so let's finish up with talking about the sacrifices as they happened and then don't happen today. Again, if you're looking in the Old Testament, you see sacrifice. It's there from, as we saw in Genesis, from the time of Noah all the way until the end of the Old Testament, or essentially the end of the Old Testament. But we don't see that really after AD 70. And so again, this is something that ends with the events that destroy the temple in Jerusalem. And so from that time period on, there have not been sacrifices that have taken place. Now, as we said, that wasn't the first time in Jewish history that that's happened, but that's the last time. And so for about 2,000 years, no Jews have been offering sacrifices to God. The function of having no priest and having no temple would mean, as we said before, that it really would be probably considered an abomination before God for just someone to offer a sacrifice somewhere to him. Even if you had a burnt offering, well, what would God want with that? Unless you are offering it in the temple and you're making sure that you're offering it as a priest. If there's no priesthood, there's no temple, you really can't make these kind of offerings. I guess you could, but whenever Saul tried that, if you'll recall, and he did so before Samuel got there, the throne was taken away from his family forever. So why take the chance of making an offering that you really aren't supposed to be making in the first place? Aside from that, if the Jews decided that they were going to start offering animal sacrifices today, do you think that would turn some heads at PETA? Do you think there'd be any problems, ethically speaking, today in our modern world? And so it probably wouldn't go over all that well. That's maybe a minor concern if you're trying to be obedient to God. But certainly there is a bit of a difference between our standards today and what happened a few thousand years ago. If God commanded it still, we would still do it, but things have changed quite a bit. Now, the Bible is clear, though. The Old Testament will prove this as well. But to summarize the idea, go back to Hebrews that we looked at before, and we see much reference being made to the idea that blood is necessary for the remission of sin. In fact, it says in verse 22 of the text that was read for us, without shedding of blood, there is no remission. Okay, I have to say that if I were a Jew today, just as we seek to go back to what the Bible originally teaches, I think I would have a pretty hard struggle with this concept. Because I'm living, even if I live as close as I can to the Jewish law, if there really is no remission of sin without the shedding of blood, where does that leave me? If there's no sacrifices being offered for the nation of Israel today, where does that leave them? It's not a great position to be in without forgiveness, stuck in that place. So probably the bigger question, though, is what do Jews do today to kind of work around this? Because, again, they haven't offered a sacrifice in 2,000 years, and so we would kind of expect that they'd have some idea of what they could do otherwise. By and large, again, we're generalizing here, but by and large, Jews today seek forgiveness by other means, and it's not that different from Christianity, really. They seek forgiveness through repentance, so a change in actions in an attempt to be pleasing to God. They certainly pray for forgiveness. We see that over and over in the Psalms, especially in the Old Testament, but they pray that they will be forgiven, although that's a challenge that you're praying to be forgiven, even though you're not offering the sacrifices of forgiveness. And a lot of it now is based on restitution. You remember some of those laws from the Old Testament as well, that if you steal somebody's ox, you have to give them more than one ox in return. And so restitution plays a role in their seeking forgiveness as well. But all those things, like I mentioned, are just kind of general, but they're things that we would do today as well as Christians. That being said, Christians are in a different category because we recognize that there has been the shedding of blood for our forgiveness. It wasn't a yearly sacrifice that was made, but it was a one-time sacrifice with blood far more valuable than the blood of bulls and goats. That's not the situation for the Jews. They just stopped. When the temple was destroyed, they stopped making the offerings, and they haven't been doing it ever since. There are some Jews today that see the sacrifices as being improper for kind of the reasons that we already said. How can you offer sacrifices to God if you don't have a temple? And so they'll kind of use that as the excuse. And it's almost a circular argument, but the argument would go that we can't offer sacrifices because we don't have a temple. And we can't build a temple because maybe I'm of the thinking that the Messiah will rebuild the temple and that he'll restore the sacrifices. And so why would I be a part of that today? Again, it kind of loops around itself. But still, that is another argument. Some more liberal thinking groups within Judaism will teach that animal sacrifice is obsolete now because it was more of a primitive form of worship, and that Judaism has progressed since then or evolved since then as a religion. But again, that tends to be more in liberal thinking. But there are ways in which the Jews think their way around this. But again, it's not a situation that I would like to be in. But all of these things put together, the sacrifice, the priesthood, and the temple, they were at one point the core of Judaism alongside the feast. The feasts are still kept by and large, but there's no animal sacrifices being made. So you could very well have the Feast of Atonement, but you're not getting any atoning that's taking place. And so I think we'll leave it at that as far as our explaining of what the Jews do differently from the time of the Old Testament until the modern day. And hopefully that does give us some insight that we probably wouldn't otherwise have into why these things are happening or how these things are being handled today. But we'll transition now into what will form an invitation, if we can do that. When God commanded sacrifices, and we see this in the Old Testament, when he commanded sacrifices, did he care about the particulars? In one sense, yes. In one sense, God demands that you do every part of what he has told. In the other side of that, though, did he really care about the sacrifice, or was he concerned with the obedience? What the writer of Hebrews tells us a little bit later on, chapter 10, in verse 4, it says, "For it is not possible that the blood of bulls and goats can take away sins." It was never about the sacrifice. It was never about the priesthood. It was never about the temple, the time of day, or the altar that it was on. It was about being obedient to God. God still demands the same obedience. In fact, he demands it maybe even more so today. Back in Hebrews chapter 2 and verse 3, this statement is made for those who are in the Christian era that have moved beyond Judaism. The phrase is spoken there, "How shall we escape if we neglect so great a salvation?" Which at first began to be spoken by the Lord and was confirmed to us by those who heard him. And so the question is, if the Jews didn't escape condemnation for the things that they had done, how much worse off will we be if we reject what God has given to us now? An easier system, certainly, and a system that has done away with the literal sacrifices, the literal temple or physical temple, and the priesthood in the Old Testament sense as well. And so this evening, if you need to respond to God's invitation, this is your opportunity to do so. If you've never put on Christ in baptism, this is your opportunity to do so. If you have questions about how that's supposed to work, or if you have other concerns of the church or that the church can help you with, we ask that you come forward as we stand and as we sing.